Hello and welcome to Springwatch 2020. I'm coming to you live from the New Forest in Hampshire, and if you've been watching this week you'll know that our mission remains the same, to bring you the very best of British wildlife, but that we've also been trying to bring you some comfort, joy and respite from this terrible pandemic by showing you the pure and simple beauty of nature. Tonight is more of the same, but we're also tonight concentrating on some of the dramas of spring. And you've been noting some of those yourself, even recording them. Look at this from Wildlife Paul. He posted this on Twitter, and it's a wren leaving its own nest here and then promptly popping into the local blue tits to feed its young. What's more, it's doing it at the same time as the adult blue tit with no animosity. And this wasn't a one-off occasion. The wren kept on doing this over and over again. Now, you may think that's fairly unique. We certainly did, until we saw this. Here is a great spotted woodpecker's nest, recorded by Stephen Langley. And there's the adult male provisioning one of the youngsters that's just about to fledge with its head out of the hole. But look, a great tit pops along with a mouthful of tasty green caterpillars. It's a little undecided to start with and it flies off, but when it comes back it does in fact feed the woodpecker those caterpillars. So what is going on here? Well, there are some cases where there are what we call mixed clutches, where a blue tit lays its eggs in a great tit's nest or vice versa. I think it's unlikely here that a wren would have laid its eggs into a blue tit's nest, or certainly a great tit into a great spotted woodpecker. Great spotted woodpeckers would promptly eat the great tits. So it could be that the nests are very close together, and that when the adult bird is coming back, it's hearing those pleading cries of the youngster, and it just can't resist that primal urge to give them the food. Or it could be that the wren's nest has failed, its own chicks have died, but that behaviour's retained, ditto with the great tit. Whatever, they're extraordinary observations. Any benefits for those birds feeding other birds' young? Not really. It could be confusing for the chicks if they're brought up, you know, as blue tits thinking they're wrens, but it's highly irregular that would actually take place, and these are unique observations. Fantastic stuff. I've been making a few of my own actually, because during lockdown I've had a little bit more time to explore my environment this spring, and I've been out into the national park with some trip cameras looking at one of the local badger sets, and I've found that they've got a whole range of different pelage colours here. One of them is what we call erysitic, eris meaning red, and it's got this reddish colour. Another one I think might be leucistic, and leuco is white in Greek, that's the origin of that word. And the last one, I think this one could even be an albino, albino albus, Latin. And all of these terms refer to the amount of pigment that they've got in their skin. Now, leucistic animals have an absence of all of the pigments, and that's why we can see them appearing in that very white way. Albinos lack melanin, that pigment that we have in our skin. It's very familiar in the animal kingdom. Now, I'm not entirely sure, it needs more observation, but I'll have some time this weekend, and my intention is to get back out there with those trip cameras and see exactly what's going on with that badger set. It's not all about the New Forest though, it's about the whole of the UK Springwatch, of course. A great range of species, a great range of dramas, and to uncover the rest of them we've got a great team of presenters. Let's go over to one of them now, a very unique species of presenter, the one and only Iolo Williams in mid-Wales.
Well, it's been drama all the way up here in sunny Montgomeryshire, Chris, since the weekend. What's happened? Well, it all revolves around a family of blackbirds. Gardener came over here just to cut back the tall grass, because this is an official path leading to the woods behind me. She trimmed away. To her horror, she found in this old walnut stump here a blackbird nest with 4 chicks in it. She didn't panic. She went and got some sticks, some branches, as you can see, some foliage, because it gets very hot in there, covered up the chicks, gave them a bit of shelter, and it worked. The adults came back and forth, fed the chicks, and I'm pleased to say that all 4 fledged yesterday morning. They went straight away down towards the wood behind me with the parents. So we sent our wildlife cameraman, Steve Phillips, to see if he could find them. Well, I've got to be honest, they've gone into the thickest bramble bush you have ever seen in your life. They are firmly ensconced in there, not a chance of seeing them. But Steve did catch up with a couple of the adult birds. carrying food for the young. This is the male here. He's got a beak full of invertebrates. He's clucking away. That's his alarm call. And notice what he's carrying. Not a single earthworm. They do eat an awful lot of earthworms, but the ground here is so dry now that they just cannot reach them. We also, of course, have some fabulous nests here in Wales, not in Montgomeryshire, but down in Monmouthshire with cameras on them. So let's go and have a look at our goshawk nest. This is a big, big nest high up in a tree in a conifer plantation. Here's the female here, bringing in a grey squirrel for the 3 chicks that now are about 2.5 weeks old. And over the last few days, they have been bringing in an awful lot of grey squirrels. And of course, it's spring. The young squirrels are out and about. They're inexperienced and they're no match for a hunting machine like a goshawk. And when I was working for the RSPB back in the 1980s, early 90s, we did a lot of work on goshawk in upland plantations. And what we found was that although they eat a wide variety of prey, the bulk of what they eat is corvids, pigeons, and squirrels. Lots and lots of squirrels. And Gillian, I think there's a lot more action to come from that nest yet.
That is amazing. Yes, we have many nest cameras. This spring, our nest cameras are really delivering. And one camera we've been watching quite closely recently is this one. Now, this is our jackdaw family. This is live. And right now there are a couple of chicks in there, and they're really quite large. We've been watching this for the past week. Both parents have been provisioning the nest. But we've seen some really unusual behaviour as well. We've had Dr. Gil McIver from the University of Exeter to analyse some of this behaviour. So the chicks in this here, they're on their own and they're disturbed by a noise outside. This is a nest cavity tree in a tree. Other birds have flushed away as well. And this is what arrives. It's an adult jackdaw, but this is an adult male. We're pretty sure of that because of the brightness of that nape there. And he comes in and investigates the chicks. This is not the parent. You can see there's a little aggressive behavior there, but the parent shows up pretty quickly after that. And look at what it does. It flushes out that interloping male. Quite likely he was in there investigating new territories, possibly a bit aggressive towards those chicks, but they are quite large. They're going to be ready to fledge probably within the next week. So keep watching on our live streams for more drama. And I'm sure there's drama on the River Thames with Steve.
It is always dramatic here, Gillian, no doubt. And we've been dealing over the course of this week with lots of the birds I'm lucky enough to share my little patch of heaven with. Some of them are long-distance migrants that may have travelled thousands of miles to get here. Others, birds that we see all year round. And one of those is the reed bunting. So I thought that we would now throw to our live reed bunting nest. That's not here, that's down in the Mendips. So let's have a little look at what's going on down there at the moment. You can see where it's located in that reed bed. This is above ground, it's not actually above water. And there you can see the nest you can see one chick. There are 2 chicks in there. It kind of looks a little bit like a bit of hipster artisanal basket work, doesn't it? Incredibly neat and tidy. The 2 of them there hunkered down, almost invisible inside that nest, although when they stand up and start flapping around, all of a sudden they become much more evident. So you can't see the parents at the moment, neither of the adult birds coming in to provision them, but yesterday both the male and the female were coming into the nest, carrying with them invertebrates, things like damselflies. And you can see the female bird here looking with what I would imagine is distress at the young chick who seems willing to be trying to leave the nest. Now, you can still see lots of bare pink flesh there. Clearly the feathers aren't ready for them to fly yet, but it seems that they may already be about to head out of this nest. You know, they are little more than a week old, and yet they may be about to scamper. It's possible that could happen over the weekend, so we're going to be keeping a very close eye on that. And it could just be down to the fact that that nest is quite exposed. We've had otters and foxes seen on the remote cameras in that area, lots of predators around. It's very close to the ground, that nest, so maybe they just would be a lot less vulnerable if they got out of the nest and can fend for themselves, at least able to scamper away. So Chris, what have you got for us?
Well, I think, Steve, the thing is, that's an example of what Michaela might call semi-fledging. She came up with that phrase a few years ago. When these young birds actually leave the nest, they don't fly, proper fledging, but as you say, they scamper about. And you can keep your eyes on all of those nests 24/7 by looking at the BBC iPlayer and the BBC Springwatch page. Keep your eyes on over the weekend, potential activity in all of those places. Now, spring is a time of a lot of frantic activity. Lots of species, of course, trying to breed effectively when resources are at their maximum. But to do that, they've got to stay alive. And the fight for survival is the most important drama that's playing out in habitats all across the UK. And there is none more perilous than the relationship between rodent and raptor.
The Cotswolds in early spring. A quintessentially British landscape. A patchwork of countryside created by generations of farming. Amongst the field of crops, there are pockets of rough grassland, rich islands of life, which support a diversity of species. Hidden from view by the grassy canopy, one of the UK's most common mammals, the field vole, thrives. On average, Britain is home to 75 million field voles, whose populations fluctuates between boom and bust. This year, numbers are high. This pregnant female could have as many as 1,600 vole neighbours in this 8-hectare field. They'll all be fattening up. At this time of year, each vole can put on 1/4 of its body weight in a month. That means a lot of nibbling. This little mother-to-be will need to eat her own body weight in grass every day. And to find the most protein-rich vegetation, she'll have to break cover, making her vulnerable to attack from above. Dense populations of voles attract attention. Several species of raptor compete fiercely for hunting rights and airspace here. Every move risks betraying a vole's position to eager eyes in the sky. A male barn owl is hunting. His hearing is so acute he can detect his prey from sound alone. His large velvety wings enable slow and stealthy flight. The leading edges of the flight feathers are serrated with tiny hooks which deaden the sound of each beat. Near silent flight enables him to hear the slightest sounds produced by voles and approach them undetected. Our little female is safe, but another vole isn't so lucky. But the barn owl will be back. In order to survive and reproduce, a pair of barn owls will catch almost 2,000 voles a year. Short-eared owls are visitors, staying in southern England between November and early April, drawn by the profusion of prey. They are expert hunters, extremely agile in the air. They hunt by flying back and forth 3 meters above the ground, looking and listening for any field vole movements below. They hunt voraciously before returning to their breeding grounds in upland Britain and Scandinavia. This makes early spring a particularly risky time for the voles. But the pregnant female must carry on feeding regardless. The silent hunter spots its prey. This time, a mouse reaches the end of its life. Our female is lucky. The high number of field voles here mean that though many are taken, many survive. As the sun sets over this corner of the Cotswolds, she's safe in a perilous little kingdom for now. Short-eared owls. Oh, short-eared owls. There is something magical about short-eared owls, isn't there? I spend quite a bit of time up on the Welsh moors when I'm not in lockdown, of course, mid and North Wales, mainly monitoring breeding hen harriers and merlins, and every now and again, once in a blue moon, you come across a pair of short-eared owls. And there's nothing as magical as when you're sitting in the heather of an evening watching the short-eared owl quartering back and forth over the heather, over the grassland, hunting mice and voles and small birds. Absolutely stunning. And it looks like a big bird, but actually it's not. Yes, the wingspan from tip to tip is over a metre, but they're very light. They only weigh maybe 300, 330 grams. That's why the flight is so buoyant. And if you're ever lucky enough to be able to hold one, you'll see what I mean. It's all feathers. It's a very enigmatic bird as well. We don't really know that much about it. We know that numbers fluctuate widely because their vole numbers have peaks and troughs. Their vole prey have peaks and troughs. And we know that last year was a dreadful year, fewer than 600 pairs here in the UK. And because numbers are declining, in 2017, the BTO, led by John Calladine, carried out research into these birds. They attached these tags onto the birds. Now, these are run by solar power here, so they last for a long time. They'll give you a fix every 3 hours, and you can pinpoint the bird up to just a few meters. So it's a brilliant piece of technology. What have these shown us so far? Well, come over to this map and let me show you the extraordinary story of a female short-eared owl called Dumiat. I hope I've got the name right there. Now, she was first caught in the uplands above Stirling there as a breeding female. I saw them putting the tag on there. The following winter, she stayed local. She didn't go very far at all. And then for the next breeding season, 2018, she just moved slightly north to the uplands above Perth. And in April 2018, we know she was incubating eggs. Those eggs hatched, and then, remarkably, she abandoned the chicks. She left the chicks in the nest for the male to look after. The male, to his credit, did a remarkable job, and all those chicks fledged. But Dumiat, where did she go? Well, I'll tell you where she went. She left Scotland altogether, 14-hour journey across the North Sea, all the way up here to Norway, where, remarkably, she bred again. Almost 1,000 kilometres from where she first bred that same spring here in Scotland. She incubated the eggs hatched, and you've guessed it, once again, she abandoned the chicks to the male. Now, this, we are learning from these tags, is normal behaviour for short-eared owls. We had no idea about this before. She left, then she went on a long journey right across Britain, ended up here on the west coast of Ireland, spent a bit of time there. Then she went down to Cornwall and Devon, across southern England to the North Norfolk coast. And then in early spring 2019, she headed off on a long journey back to Norway. Now, she'd been flying for a remarkable 26 hours when she hit a storm. Unfortunately, that knocked her off course, and instead of arriving at Norway, she went northwest and she perished. She perished just 25 kilometers from the Norwegian coast. Sad tale of a remarkable bird that's given us some fascinating science. But it doesn't end there, because we still have 3 tagged birds in the UK. All 3 were tagged on the Isle of Arran, up here in the southwest of Scotland. 1 male and 2 females. The male is still there, he hasn't moved. 1 female moved across to northeast England, to Durham, where this spring she's paired up, she's bred, she's incubated her eggs, and we've just learnt in the last 24 hours that those eggs have hatched. The other female, female number 2, stayed on Arran to breed this spring. But while she was incubating the eggs, she made several journeys across to Kintyre, just to have a look around, and then went back to her nest. And the latest information we have is that 48 hours ago the eggs hatched, and she has just abandoned those chicks. Where she'll go, we don't yet know. There's so much more information we have to learn. And of course, when that information comes in, we'll pass it on to you. But for now, a massive thumbs up to John Calladine and the team at the BTO. Brilliant stuff. Right, okay, it's that time of the evening now. You know what it is. It's our mindfulness moment, when we stop what we're doing, stop everything you're doing. If there's any noise on in that room, turn it off, because we're going to take some deep breaths. We're in lockdown. It's an incredible, difficult time for so many people. I spoke to a friend of mine over the weekend. She lives in a block of flats in North London, and she feels hemmed in. She really does. And one of the few joys she gets is looking out of a window at the wildlife. She's seen a kestrel, and one joyous moment, she saw a peregrine falcon go past. I can't tell you how much pleasure that brought her. Well, hopefully we can add to that pleasure, because for the next 90 minutes, you are going to get nothing but the sounds and the sights of spring. Cameraman Lindsay McRae brings us the essence of his local woodland up in the Lake District.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I love being in woodland, because you are in woodland when you think about it. You're on a beach, you're on moorland, you're on grassland, but when you're in woodland, you're enveloped with all of this life. And I find that really cosy and comforting. I love the fact that I'm sort of sneaking through a sponge of life. Every surface is just erupting with energy. It's a beautiful place to be. Next week, we've got some real treats coming up for you, some more nest cameras. I'm going to tease you with one now. Look at this. This is a common sandpiper. It's down in Wales, and this is one of the birds coming back to brood the young in the nest. Characteristic bit of tail bobbing there, and then it settles down. What a lovely shot. And I've got to tell you, there's already been some drama on that nest, and we'll be keeping you up to date next week. And today's programme is all about drama, but what about a dramatic transformation? What about one of the most dramatic transformations that takes place in the animal kingdom? Smoltification. So which species smoltify? Well, it's the Atlantic salmon, because they are what we call anadromous fish. They spend part of their time in freshwater and part of their lives in seawater, salty water, allowing them to exploit, quite literally, the best of both worlds. So how do they do this? Well, as you know, Atlantic salmon swim back up the rivers they were spawned in, and they lay their eggs and they hatch into fry, and they begin to grow into parr. And parr are the small salmon that live in these rivers. And thanks to Chris Conroy from the Nest Salmon, what is he? Let me just get this right. It's quite complicated. Nest District Salmon Fishery Board. We've got these pictures of parr beneath the surface of the water. And these little fish live in these Scottish rivers, and there they're feeding on whatever they can find that drifts down the river. And you can see their characteristic colouring. They've got what we call parr marks, those bars that run down the side of the body, those beautiful little red spots. And that's all about camouflage, as they're trying to blend in with the background. And at this time of their lives, they're quite territorial, they're solitary. And if any other fish come into their territories, they do anything they can to push them away. So there's quite a lot of posturing. They'll sidle up to one another, they'll do a bit of showing off. And if that doesn't work, they'll chase the other fish and nip it and chase it away. A little bit of fishy violence. And this is all about monopolising that small amount of food that is in the river. So the question, therefore, is why do the salmon come all the way into the river to reproduce when they need to grow quite rapidly and there isn't much food there? Well, the simple reason is that there aren't that many predators in the fresh water compared to the sea. However, there are some. And Chris has got these beautiful pictures of goosanders foraging away on the riverbed. And look how they've transformed their bodies into these mercurial forms. And look, one there gets a smolt. Look at that. Fantastic. And there are other predators as well, things like seals, of course, and even larger fish like the trout as well. So, after a period of time, these fish need to move out to get the growing done. It's then that they need to go through this process of smoltification. And what triggers that is a number of things. Firstly, they've got to get to 12 centimetres inside. Nothing will happen until they're at least 12 centimetres. And then the increasing daylight in spring triggers that process to start with a little bit of help from warmer water. And that transformation is quite remarkable. They start to put guanine into their scales and skin, and there this chemical crystallises to make them silvery like this. So gone are those bars on their body whilst they were parr, and when they're smolts they go silvery. They also change their behaviour. They're not hanging around on the bottom anymore. They're rising up further into the water, and they're also not solitary either. They're beginning to school together. They're tolerant of one another's presence. So this is not just a physical change in their colouring, it's also a significant change in their behaviour too. And this process, this smoltification, remarkably only takes 3 weeks. So once they've smoltified, then it's the next stage. And this means that they're going to move from the rivers all the way down into the sea. So they start in those rivers and they begin to drift down in these schools of fish here, and they will head out to sea. And it's there that they need to complete the most remarkable part of the process, which is the physiological changes that take place, because moving from freshwater to saltwater means that they have to deal with the loss of water, the gain of salts, and in order to do that they have to concentrate their urine and also use special cells which develop in their gills to excrete that salt. Why do they want to move into the sea? Well, because there's more food there. That's where they get all their growing done. They move down as these little smolts and they come back as those massive salmon because there's a lot more food there, and at this stage they can deal with a little bit more predation. But the most remarkable thing is that there is a window. Once they've gone through smoltification, they've got to get to the sea, and if they don't get there in time for any reason, a barrier of some kind, they can actually partially desmoltify. They won't go completely back to the par with the little stripes on, but they will revert to a type of fish that can live in fresh water. What about that? What an astonishing transformation. Imagine that. That's a bit like us growing up, turning into adults and thinking, do you know what? I'm not very happy with the responsibilities of adulthood, the mortgage, the car, the insurance, the education of the kids. I'm going to regress and be an adolescent. What do you think, Gillian? Would you be up for a bit of de-adultification?
You know, I got to agree, being an adult is totally overrated. It really is. Well, we are going to stay with the river theme over here because I'm still at Woodland Valley Farm, my own beautiful little piece of wilderness brought to you courtesy of Cornwall Beaver Project, of course, courtesy of the beaver themselves. Now, this is a 5-year scientific study, like many across the country, designed to see what impact beavers have on the environment. This study here is highly regulated, but that's not always the case, especially in places like River Tay in Scotland. Now, a few days ago, Scottish Natural Heritage released a report that showed 87 beavers had been shot and killed, albeit under license, between May and December of last year. And in addition to that, 83 of their dams were completely destroyed and removed. Now, over here, we have an opportunity to ask ourselves a simple question: why do beavers build dams? And the answer is quite simple. It's because they want to feel safe. Now, these are large semi-aquatic mammals, and they build these dams to create ponds and lakes because they feel more confident in deep and still water. And they can swim with ease in the water. They'll dive for as many as 15 minutes. So this really is about creating a habitat for themselves. And if they can't find a suitable habitat, well, they'll make it. So that's the why. But how do they do that? Now, this is where it gets really interesting, and we've got a dam right here, so we get to unpick, not literally though, I must say, unpick how they make these dams. And of course, we don't want to do that because this is an incredible structure holding back along here about 1 million litres, in this one site alone, 1 million litres of water. So that's an enormous amount of pressure along this dam and other structures along here. So in order to try and appreciate exactly how beavers do this, I'm going to make like a beaver, and I'm going to try and build a beaver dam myself right here. But I'm not going to do this easily because we have to, remember that beavers work mostly at night. So that's why I'm wearing this rather brightly colored thing. And frankly, the colors are least of my problems right now, because what beavers do is, in the cover of darkness, they start with these very big branches and they drive them in against the water current, something like that at an angle, and they push those in, and then they get more twigs, and I tell you, this is very compromising, but they weave those in, and then they get handfuls of mud, and they'll move upstream, and they pack that in, and eventually they have a watertight structure. Clearly, they're much better at it than I am. Why don't we take a look at how the beavers do it themselves? So this dam here is obviously in much better shape. This is, I remind you, under the cover of darkness. And the beaver moves in and is placing some of the last branches on top there. Now they will move upstream from the dam and start to actually push in mud and grass and pieces of leaves, and they'll use the force of the water itself to actually ram all of that into the dam, and it creates a watertight seal. Now, this is an amazing structure, an amazing feat of engineering to actually be able to hold that much pressure. And it creates a habitat for themselves, but also creates a real benefit to us because it helps to reduce flooding, but it also clears up water. And it does that by slowing the flow of water through this enclosure. And you can see the dam there. Now, without the dam, water would flow through this whole little system here in about 15 minutes. But with the dam, it flows in about an hour. And that gentler water flow means that sediment, but more importantly, pollutants, will settle out of the water. And what trickles out here is much cleaner and much clearer. And that benefits all sorts of wildlife. Now, right here, we have in this tank a beautiful little caddisfly larvae. This belongs to the family Limnophilidae. It means, I suppose, rock-loving. Now you can see the larva there. It's actually encased itself in a silken sort of casing woven in with grains of sand to help with camouflage as it moves along the rock. Now what's interesting about these is they are bioindicators, which means they indicate the water quality. They're very, very, very sensitive to pollutants and contaminants in the water. So the presence of this little thing right here is a great sign about the water quality. Now we've had loads of help from Cornwall Wildlife Trust, particularly Tom Shelley, their conservation manager, helping us with what we might be able to find around this site. And one of the things, and I have to say, when he told me there was one of these, I thought he was having me on. Freshwater limpets. I don't know if you've heard of these, but I certainly hadn't. And those are in here. And freshwater limpets are really quite interesting. They're not quite as sensitive as the caddisfly larvae to pollutants, but they are really quite widespread around the country. And if you're the sort of person that likes to go looking for some of these things, then you may want to do that and possibly find those, because I thought they were quite interesting. So all of this, the water quality, the dams, all of it down to a bunch of beavers. So from beavers to badgers. And that's a much more common and familiar nocturnal animal, as we know. But it also leaves its mark, as naturalist Hannah Stitfall found out on her daily walks during lockdown.
Living in a town, it's easy to feel detached from the natural world and miss the signs of spring. And recently, it's been even more difficult to reconnect with nature. So, I decided to turn my daily walk into a hunt for the local wildlife. Just a 15-minute walk from my front door is Newquay Community Orchard. Here, nature has been given the space to thrive, a place packed with diverse habitats. I've seen house sparrows nesting, shield bugs and butterflies mating, as well as a host of invertebrates and bird life. But it's in a far less obvious spot nearby that I ended up witnessing and becoming totally involved with a real wildlife drama. In this scrubby patch of hedgerow near the orchard, I found some animal tracks that could only have been made by a large mammal, so I immediately thought badger. Now, badgers are creatures of habit, and they'll use the same paths night after night as they leave the set to where they forage. So as I followed the trails towards the tangled thicket, lo and behold, there was a gigantic badger set surrounded by soil and fresh bedding. So I got the landowner's permission to set up my cameras and then waited patiently until I could check the footage again on my next daily walk. The results from the first few nights were, needless to say, tantalising. I kept coming back night after night on my daily walk, setting up the traps, trying to get that perfect angle to capture the action. I had everything crossed. And finally, my perseverance paid off as I got to see a gorgeous badger family. 2 very healthy adults and 3 enormous cubs. Now, urban cubs are often bigger than their rural cousins, but these are giants. It's highly likely that she gave birth very early in the winter. It was wonderful to watch this family thrive in the town and watch the cubs become bolder every night. I'd been watching the cubs for a week or so, then one day returned to look at the footage, and there were no cubs, not one. Cub mortality in badgers is high, with only 1 in 3 surviving to its first birthday. I had become so attached to my little family, and I just wanted to know that they were okay. But I kept checking the footage every night and there was still no sign of them. I was totally devastated. I went one last night to put the traps up. My heart was in my mouth as I knew that this was going to be the last time I would do this. But to my absolute relief, one cub appeared, then another cub appeared. Sadly, I never saw the third cub again. As a naturalist, I understand the risks that urban badgers take, as well as the rewards for sharing their space with humans. But I was so pleased to see 2 of them bounding around playfully as they had done in the weeks before. I've made a real connection with this family, one that I will always remember this spring for.
When I started off as a young naturalist, the essential tools were things like a magnifying glass and a butterfly net and a bucket, and now you can add to that a camera trap. They are an absolutely amazing tool. I mean, sure, you still need the same skills to be able to track the animals and put yourself into their heads, but if you do it right, then they do all the hard work while you're tucked up nice and safe in bed. And the excitement of just not knowing what you're going to get on those images is just absolutely amazing. So since lockdown began, I've been kind of running my own mini Springwatch from home, and I've kind of turned into a wildlife peeping Tom with cameras pretty much set up all over my local area, particularly in the local badger set. So the badger set is in a bit of beautiful beech woodland, and during the daytime you get wandering through shot roe deer and these muntjac as well. That's a female there who hasn't got any horns. And then come about this time of night, the badgers come out, and the 2 cubs, there's just 2 of them, seem to spend at least the first hour doing nothing but mucking about, playing, fighting. And the main game seems to be grabbing a hold of your brother or sister's tail and just trying to tear it off with your teeth. Obviously, they are just, they're learning their skills, they're preparing, but it's amazing to watch. And it's incredible how much information you can glean from these clips. So this is 2 muntjacs. It's probably the female and her youngster, her fawn or kid. And you can see the tail there is raised. It's possible that the youngster can scent that the female is now receptive, and therefore that the youngster needs to start heading off and making a future of its own. So I've been following the fortunes of lots of animals around here, including the swallows and the ducks and the geese that have been nesting in my garden, exulting with their triumphs and being utterly crushed by their failures. But there are no animals that are as important to me as this one right here. So this is the pen or female of the pair of swans that are resident on our little patch of river. And we think that they got together at the same time as me and my wife, which is obviously incredibly romantic. The first few times that they tried to nest was on our front lawn, on our garden. And to begin with, they were pretty haphazard with it. It was a bit of a disaster. And then eventually, in I think 2017, they did manage to have a successful youngsters here with a nest which was composed mostly of stuff that was ripped from our lawn, so our hose pipe and the mop bucket and a rope and my mountaineering boots. And despite the fact that they were still super territorial with anyone else who came into the garden, they were very, very accepting of Helen and I, and would sit by while the cygnets came up and pretty much got into our laps. So right now, the pen is in front of me. She is pretty much all the time on the nest. You can see her just moving around now. Occasionally she will shift the eggs around, turning the eggs. And if she does leave the nest, she'll cover it up to try and make sure that predators can't see it. Last year, that unfortunately didn't succeed, and foxes did come in and predate the nest. And seriously, it was absolutely crushing. But if all goes well, in a couple of weeks' time, we will have a swan family here on the Reach, and it's always a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. They keep very close to the parents, both mother and father, super, super protective, and they will even allow the young cygnets to clamber right up onto their backs in between their wings, which is just beyond cute, covered in that extraordinary downy grey fur. So you might think that this is not how you normally expect to see me talking about wildlife. I mean, normally I'm sort of diving with crocodiles and sharks and things, and seeing me kind of having this emotional connection to wildlife might seem a little bit strange, but I think it's some of it down to the fact that I now have my own family, and that starts making you thinking very different about nature. So Helen and I had babies who have only really had life in lockdown. Our twins were born just before lockdown, and our firstborn son, Logan, is coming up to 2 now. And there is no greater joy than seeing his eyes light up when, for example, we head out in the big red canoe to feed the local goslings.
Baby swans. Baby swans.
They're not baby swans, these are baby geese. They're goslings. You say goslings?
Goslings.
Goslings. We were feeding them peas there, and I think that Logan actually ate more than he gave away. He came back with them smeared all over his face. He looked like Shrek. You know, I was prepared for there to be an emotional response to experiencing nature through his eyes for the first time again, but I wasn't prepared for the amount of nostalgia, this almost sense of melancholy with a return to my own childhood and how my parents introduced me to nature, because it's been such a powerful presence in my life. It's been my inspiration, it's been my medicine, my escape. And I really hope that for my young family, it can be the same. And they can also get pleasure from the simple things like heading out into the back field and going looking for butterflies and beetles.
Ladybird.
It's not a ladybird, but it is a beetle. Oh! Yeah, that was me for the second time correcting my not quite 2-year-old on what kind of species a beetle was. I am going to be a horrific father. But, you know, I so hope that they embrace nature the same way I have, because it has given me so much and been the greatest gift that my parents gave me, this connection to the wild world. And now, just pure and simple, to sit with the babies on our laps watching the bird feeders beats the hell out of Netflix. And Chris, I don't know about you, but I'm hearing from a lot of people all over the country that, you know, over this last few months, it's been a great thing for families to do together.
I think you're right, Steve. I think you're right. I also think you're going to make a great father, by the way. You've got to be critical. You've got to teach them the right thing at the right time. But just like your family, I think a lot of people throughout lockdown have been connecting with that nature. And one of the ways they've been doing it is with the bird feeders outside their window. I mean, I've been locked down here for the last 9 weeks with my stepdaughter here, Megan McCubbin, and we spent ages looking at the bird feed, haven't we? Every day we get up and have breakfast, we're looking out the window.
All the time. We're constantly looking at it, but we're not alone with that. 75% of UK residents regularly feed their birds, and of course that sets the stage for so much wildlife drama. I mean, who needs soaps when you've got bird
Not
feeders?
me. I mean, I'd rather watch the bird feeder than EastEnders, to be honest with you.
I think I'd have to agree with that as well. But of course, in the 70s, there was mainly things like the starlings and the house sparrows which monopolised those feeders. But they're such a valuable resource that it's increased biodiversity massively.
Yeah, I remember in the 70s, my mum used to rush outside. We had starlings and sparrows on the feeders, and she'd run out with a tea towel, chasing them all away because she wanted the prettier birds, the blue tits, to take advantage of it. And of course now, like you say, it's sped up to the enormous number of species that come in.
Exactly. We now know that there's 133 different species coming to feed from our feeders, which is over half of the UK breeding population, but half the UK breeding species, which is pretty remarkable. And we love feeding our birds so much that, in fact, with all the seed that we put out there, we could sustain 196 individual birds, if there were that many in the UK.
It's like million birds.
196 million birds.
Exactly.
Which is absolutely astonishing. But of course, they are in such close proximity to one another that there's going to be increased competition on those feeders. So I came up with a bit of an experiment of my own to determine how those range in our own garden. So what I decided to do is I decided to set up a camera. I attached it onto our bird feeder there. And I wanted to get an idea of all those interactions going on. So I sat a bit further back at a distance that wasn't going to interrupt the natural behaviour of those birds. I've got my pen and my paper, my binoculars, and I sat there for an hour just noting down those interactions. And we get quite a lot of birds in our feeder, don't we? We've got a great spot there.
Yeah, good range.
Yeah, it's quite a few. Look, goldfinches coming in there. And they're all quite happy at the moment with one another, aren't they?
Well, they are at the moment, but it's not always like that, is it?
It's really not always like that at all. No.
One of the species we saw coming in that was getting particularly bolshy was nuthatch.
Nuthatch. Now, they are slightly bigger, and when they come in, it seems that all the smaller species tend to fly away. Now, you have to look quite closely at this. It happens quite fast. We've got a greenfinch sat up there at the moment, happily taking into this. And there's the nuthatch coming in, scaring everything off, flying away. And there's a great tit there, still looking nervous as that nuthatch flies away. But it's not all about the nuthatch. The nuthatch doesn't have top position. That goes to the great spotted woodpecker. Have a look at this. So here we are. This is the male coming in. Sat there, you can tell, oh, that's a female, sorry, coming in there. You can tell the difference because she has an entirely black head. The male has a red spot on the back of his head. And the only thing that's going to scare away a great spotted woodpecker is another great spotted woodpecker. In this case, that's the male. You can see that red spot there quite clearly. They're probably a breeding pair, nesting quite close to each other, but you can see that interaction. But I'm not the only one that's done that experiment. The University of Exeter and the BTO came together to judge the social interactions on their feeders with 10 different species. Now, of course, fighting can be incredibly costly. You can get injury, and at worst case scenario, you can potentially get fatal injuries too. So, I mean, it's better to have a natural dominance hierarchy that avoids all of this. And what they found on their study, looking at my graph here you have the dominance ranks, 10 being least dominant, 1 being the highest, and body mass down the bottom here. There was a very significant relationship between the two. At the bottom, we have the coal tit. Now, that weighs about 9 grams. So it's a relatively small bird, and it ranks at the lowest. At the top, we've got house sparrow.
That's surprising that they're the hardest birds on the feeder, house sparrow.
Hardest birds on the feeder. Well, they weigh 27 grams.
Right.
So they're right at the top there. Nuthatch, of course, here.
Yeah.
That's who we saw coming in to chase everything away. That weighs about 22 grams. But of course, not everybody likes to fit in with the rules, do they? We have some rebels going on. We have a bit of an anomaly. And in this case, that is the chaffinch who's here. Now, the chaffinch actually weighs the same as a nuthatch, 22 grams. However, it's very low on the pecking order. It is outranked by so many smaller birds going on there.
I think I know why that is, though. And that's because chaffinches primarily feed on the seed that's dropped beneath the feeder. So if they do perch on the feeder, it's not their kind of sort of natural foraging position. And they would be easily displaced because they think, oh, I'll go down where we normally feed because they're a ground-feeding finch. So I think it could be their natural behaviour sort of replicating itself. They don't need to be dominant, they'll just go down and pick it up.
Which makes sense, And of course, this is a trend which you might have guessed, the bigger and heavier you are, the badder you potentially are. But the most interesting thing I found about this study was that the small birds, things like the coal tits and the blue tits, spent less time on the feeders, but had an increased pecking rate. And they were going for lower quality food. Whereas the bigger species, like the great spotted woodpecker, spent more time on the bird feeders, perhaps it felt a bit more confident, spent less time pecking, and they went for higher quality food.
There we are. All the drama that plays out on our feeders if you pay a little bit more attention to it. And that's something you could be doing this weekend, a bit of citizen science.
Absolutely. Why not give that experiment a go yourself? Sit out there with your family, a pen and paper, that's all you need, and watch from a fair distance as to not disturb that behaviour. And it's a great thing to do.
Excellent stuff, excellent stuff. Well, very sadly, we're just about running out of time now, but we do have a chance to look at some pictures that you've sent us. Let's take a look at this one. It's a picture of a frog. But if you look very closely at that frog there, you can see that there's a tiny little springtail, and we think it's Springwatch aquaticus. Yes, Springwatch aquaticus, of course, a springtail that lives on the water surface and typically lays its eggs into duckweed. What about this, though? Another clip. This is white-tailed eagle looking very closely at a deer swimming across a Scottish loch. Now, it could be looking for potential prey because this species will swoop down and take ducks and geese off the surface of the water. As it is, it harasses the deer, which speeds up a little bit and comes to no harm. And that clip was sent to us by none other than Gordon Buchanan, who I'm very pleased to say will be joining us as a guest presenter next week. And we look forward to that. We also look forward to a lot more animal action in the form of this.
When the tide goes out, a whole cast of animals start to reveal themselves.
It seems every species has one thing on its mind.
What about that? Superb. Absolutely superb. You won't want to be missing that, will you? You will not want to be missing all of that action next week. One thing you will sadly be missing is the presence of our guest presenter this week, the one and only Steve Backshall. Steve, thanks so much for letting us delve into your watery wet bits down on the side of the Thames.
Well, there was no need to go into my watery wet bits, Chris. But, oh, yeah, look who I've got with me right now, an old friend. Thank you so much for having me as a part of this. It feels like a really special series to be a part of this week, and I can only wish you all the very, very best of luck for the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Steve. Well, of course, you're back to parental duties next week. You're going to swap from all that swanning around in the garden. You'll be back on nappy duty, I'm afraid, mate. But, of course, I'll be back next week, along with Gillian and Yolo too. So do join us at 8 o'clock from Tuesday next week. But the action doesn't stop. You can continue to watch our cameras live 24/7 on the iPlayer and the BBC Springwatch page. And at the moment, there's a vote running which will allow you to choose which of the nests you can watch throughout the course of the day. And there are 4 choices. You can go for the jackdaws, you can go for the blue tits, you can go for the tree creeper, or you can go for the goose. Now, I'd like you to visit this BBC Springwatch page to look at the terms and conditions and the privacy. And if you are watching on catch up, then make sure that you're putting your vote in at the right time, because the votes close at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Vote for that and join us at 8 o'clock next week on Tuesday. And until then, goodbye.
The Open University is inviting you to take part in its brand new citizen science project, OU Pollinator Watch, created to help us discover more about insect pollinators. To find out how to identify a selection of insect pollinators and share your very own observations or photos, visit bbc.co.uk/Springwatch and follow the links to the Open University.